Morning everyone. This morning what I'd like to do to start the session is to begin with a meditation on this no self. So today we're of course moving into discussing the Vipassana practice, and we saw there that in one of the insights we're cultivating in these three marks of existence is this insight into no self. And what we're going to do in this practice is to look for this autonomous me that seems to be here. That there seems to be a me here that seems to be something a little bit more than just the body and the mind. Now, as with all Vipassana practices, we are looking for the truth, trying to discover the truth, the reality. So we're being like an empirical scientist, investigating through our direct observation to see what the reality is. So what we don't want to do in this or any Vipassana practice is allow our intellectual mind to contaminate the investigation. Because most of us probably have some sort of intellectual belief system on who we think we are, which may or may not be accurate, may or may not be correct. But that's not the point here. We're not wanting to confirm our belief system. We're looking for the truth. So we don't want the intellectual mind to come into this meditation and go, I know what the answer is, I'm this, based on whatever belief system we may have. So leave the intellectual mind out of it and just be an empirical scientist and look in our direct observation. What is the reality? So let's do that practice now, and then we'll begin our discussions. As always, we begin by preparing the body. So keeping the back nice and straight, and at the same time allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension. And softening and relaxing all the muscles in the face. And allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Simply allowing the breath to flow naturally and effortlessly. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. and simply becoming aware of the rhythm of your breath. Noticing if it's slow or fast, deep or shallow, long or short, without trying to modify it in any way. Now, do you have a sense that there's a me here who is trying to relax the body, and a me who is trying to focus the mind on the breath? A me that seems to exist from its own side and doesn't seem to depend upon anything else to exist. Do you have this experience? Where is this me that is trying to relax the body? Is the body simply trying to relax itself? Or is there a me separate from the body who is trying to relax the body? If there seems to be a me separate from the body who is trying to relax the body, where is this me? So search thoroughly and look for the me who is trying to relax the body. where is the me who is trying to focus the mind on the breath? Is the mind simply trying to focus itself? Or is there a me separate from the mind who is trying to focus the mind? If there seems to be a me separate from the mind who is trying to focus the mind, where is this me? So again, search thoroughly and look for the me who is trying to focus the mind on the breath. Now, in your direct experience, what is actually here? There is the constant flow of physical change that is called the body. And there is the constant flow of mental experience that is called the mind. Yet, other than the body and the mind, what else is there here? If there's nothing more than the body and the mind here, then where is the me who is relaxing the body and focusing the mind on the breath? if you can't find that me, simply rest in the experience of not finding. And even if you didn't find the me, isn't there someone who's experiencing all of this? So there is a me here. But how can this me exist if we don't seem to be able to find it? The me exists as something merely labelled on the basis of the body and the mind. Nothing more than this. So yesterday we saw that the two main wings of practice are wisdom and compassion. That on the compassion wing, we saw at the foundation level, we're cultivating these four immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity. And that yesterday afternoon we saw that in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions we build on that foundation to cultivate this mind of bodhicitta, this aspiration for enlightenment for the benefit of others. And then on the wisdom wing of practice, we saw at the foundation level there, we are cultivating these three insights called the three higher trainings. So I'd like to just review those and add a little bit to that before we go on to talk about this idea of emptiness. So that first insight into impermanence, in Sanskrit of course anitya, or in Pali anicca, is to come to the insight that everything's changing moment by moment. And again, I think that's something that we probably all intellectually accept already. You know, science has proven conclusively that everything we experience is changing moment by moment. So I think none of us have any issue with that intellectually. But again, is that intellectual understanding of impermanence, is that helping us in our life? Not really. I mean, if we thought about it all the time, it may help a bit. And the reason, of course, is our behaviour is not driven by our intellectual understanding. Our behaviour is driven by instinctive habits. And our instinctive habits are actually telling us that things around us are actually quite stable and not really changing much at all. And therefore we are interacting with things around us in a distorted way, out of sync with reality. And the Buddhist assertion, of course, is if we interact with things around us in a distorted way, that leads to mental afflictions and suffering, or at least dukkha. But if we can meditate on this and internalize and come to experientially see things as changing moment by moment, then we can bring that more into daily life. Meaning we'll start to experientially see things in daily life as in flow. And what you'll find is, if that's the case, you'll find that the mental afflictions will dramatically decrease, particularly craving and attachment. Because if we experientially see things as constantly in a flow state, then there's nothing for craving and attachment to grab hold of. And likewise, there's nothing for aversion to push against. So you'll find that impermanence, if we really gain that insight, it's going to be very, very helpful for us in daily life. You'll find that mental afflictions in general would decrease, but particularly craving and attachment will dramatically decrease. And also, as I said yesterday, this insight into impermanence is very close to realizing emptiness. Very close. Because if we really gain this insight and understand everything's in a flow, if we're very intuitive about what that implies, we'll really appreciate there's no thing there at all, because it's just flow. So this is going to be very helpful to come into the Vipassana practice of emptiness, which we're going to explain shortly. Then the second insight is an insight into suffering, and of course here we mean an insight into dukkha. What is the human condition? And if we can really gain this insight experientially, what we're going to realise is that there's no genuine happiness to be found out there at all. It lies within our own mind. Likewise, the source of suffering is not out there to be found, it's within our own mind. And therefore, this insight will help us to turn our mind inwards, to look for the source of happiness and the source of suffering within ourselves, and thereby will develop the aspiration to be free of suffering. So that's, of course, renunciation. So this insight into suffering is really going to help us to actually enter into the path to liberation through this aspiration of renunciation. And then the third insight into no self, and no self is a translation of the Sanskrit term an-atman. Atman means self, an is the prefix no, not, or negation. And here, at the foundation level, the assertion is this grasping to this self that is the root of suffering, is the root cause, is the fundamental ignorance. So if we can realise this, we do not exist as a self, we can eliminate all mental afflictions and suffering and achieve nirvana. And so what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit more about this idea of self, to really try to understand better what do we mean by self. And we have to be careful when we see this word self, because sometimes in the text when they use the word self, it just means person. Example from yesterday, self versus others. So in that case, of course, self exists, because it just means myself, person, me. But here, in the context of Vipassana practice, when you see the word self, then self is a translation of the Sanskrit term Atman. And of course the Buddhist assertion is that, and this is referring to an overinflated false sense of me. So here then, self does not exist. So you have to be careful when you see the word self and ask the question, are they meaning just me, person, or are they meaning this sort of overinflated false sense of me? And usually in the context of Vipassana, it's always this way of talking about self. Now, in terms of this, there are a number of levels in which we overinflate the sense of me. And we can talk here about at least 3 levels. One sense of self is a self that is unchanging, unitary, and independent. Unchanging is obvious. Unitary means it's a single thing with no parts. And independent means completely independent of causes and conditions. Now, this sense of self is not something we would instinctively have, because this would imply a sense of self that we could have somewhere over there. And we never have a sense of self that's not somehow in conjunction with some aspect of the body and the mind. But there were some traditions at the time of the Buddha that said that there was such a self, that this was the self that went from life to life and achieved liberation. So this is only an intellectually acquired false sense of self. So normally it doesn't cause us any problems. But it's mentioned in the text because if we have a wrong way of thinking, we may end up with the conclusion that that's the real self that exists like this. But the second false sense of self is something we do instinctively have. And that is what's sometimes called an autonomous self. The technical term for that in the text you'll see is that the technical word is that it's a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And this is, we do instinctively have this sense of me. And that's the one we were addressing in the meditation we just did. That there really seems to be a me here, somewhere, that seems to be a little bit more than just the body and the mind. Something a little bit extra on top of the body and the mind. And we have that in our language. You know, sometimes we often say, I have a body, I have a mind. As if there's a third thing here. There's a me, and this me has a body and has a mind. And that's how we instinctively see ourselves very often. And that's a sense of an autonomous me, meaning a me that seems to stand apart a little bit from the body and the mind, yet it's somewhere here, it's not over there somewhere, but it has some autonomy, it's self-sufficient, it seems to exist on its own, it doesn't seem to really depend on anything else, and it seems to be very substantial. So this is the false sense of self that we were looking for in the meditation we just did. And this is the grasping to self at the foundation level that is considered to be the root cause of suffering. So if we can come to realise we do not exist as an autonomous self, we can overcome all mental affliction, suffering, and achieve nirvana. Any questions so far before I go to the third one?
Could that be based on near-death experience, where you go out of the body? It's also scientifically proven.
Correct. But that near-death experience was, the mind was still in the body, and the person was up here, and the mind was there? Was it?
No, the mind was the body.
Ah, so that's in conjunction with the mind. So that would be this, not this one. But more will come on this point.
For me, it's very difficult to understand this because for me, it's always been body, mind, and soul.
Right.
I
Right, but
understand that the soul is something, what you feel that is something else, that you really feel that is something else, and just the intellect and the body didn't matter, you know?
right, so
that would transcend.
right, so again, you know, often people ask, you know, what does Buddhism say about the soul? And then, of course, I have to ask, what's your definition of the word soul? Because probably in this room there's maybe 10 or 20 different ideas about what that word means. And often what I find is that when I ask that question, people go, actually, I haven't really thought about it. I just sort of heard it when I grew up, and I sense there's something here, so that must be the soul, because I sense something. So, of course, there's a sense of me. I mean, if there wasn't, that'd be nihilism. So Buddhism agrees, of course there's a me, and we have a sense of me. But the question is, how does this me exist? Not whether or not we exist. So what Buddhism is asserting is that the me that exists is not like this, it's not like this, and there's a third one to come. So then, if we have an idea of soul or some other term we've grown up with, then we can really look at that term and go, okay, what does that mean for me? I mean, I heard it and I sort of accept it, but what is that soul or what that I'm accepting or believing in? What is it really? What is that? Rather than just sort of, okay, yeah, I have a sense of me, therefore that must be the soul, but we don't really investigate. So that's, yeah, so we'll come to the third point in a minute.
When we meditate, we understand body and mind are three different entities.
When we meditate?
When I meditate, because I can look into the mind, I can look into my body. Therefore, these three entities, body and mind are three different entities.
Really?
That's why.
Really? So you found an I that was a different entity than the body and the mind. You found that in the meditation we did this morning.
I can look the activity of the mind.
Right, but
Suppose there is monkey.
right, but here you said that it's a different entity.
Yes.
So where is this entity I that is different from the body and the mind?
I cannot pinpoint where it is.
Okay, if you can't find it, maybe that means it's not a different entity. Because if it is a different entity, you must be able to find it. No? If the I is a different entity than the body and the mind, you should look and go, well, there's the body, there's the mind, and there's the I, if it's a different entity. Did you find that entity called I?
I could not locate it.
Okay. It could mean, of course,
All I can
it could mean we weren't looking very well. That could be a possibility, that we need to keep looking. But it could mean also, if you really can't find it and you did a thorough search, then it doesn't exist. The independent I. There was a question over here. Yeah?
This kind of mind or soul or
Well, let's just use the word I or self.
when I look at my mind or at my body, it's something other of my body, no? It's separate of my body.
It is?
It's in my body, but I can do this.
So where was it in your body? Could you point to it in the body?
It's difficult.
Why?
Yes.
Why is it difficult?
It's
Because if
difficult
you...
because it's my experience before.
Ah,
And,
but...
they told me it's here or it's here.
And did you find it there?
Yeah,
You did?
yeah.
How big is it? What does it look like? What did you find? Did you find something, or did you have just some sensations in your body?
A sensation.
Ah, so you're a sensation? Isn't sensations part of the body? Aren't sensations just part of the body? Aren't they?
No.
No? Sensations are not part of the body. No?
I think you have some kind of energy, like what we were talking about yesterday, the
So energy's not part of the body. The body doesn't have energy.
I do think the body has energy.
Well, if the body has energy, then the energy is part of the body. Otherwise, you can't say the body has energy.
But it's like when we were talking about the subtle mind, it's like nowhere,
Yeah, but the body is somewhere.
tangible.
I mean, the mind is a different thing, but the body is somewhere. It's here. No? Yeah? The energy's here. You can sense it. You can experience it. So the point here was, he sensed something here. So what did he sense? He said sensations. Good, good. But sensations are part of the body. No?
So, what is the ideal physically? Like,
This is coming.
because when we're born, there is a blank kind of a thing.
Blank thing.
In blankness, like we have no knowledge, we're in ignorance, right?
Well, not true, but
Okay. Because this is our body, this is our mother, this is our father.
right,
Now this is fed into a certain kind of awareness, you know.
right.
And when we meditate, we can see there is a certain kind of awareness that observes the thought arising and going.
Good, very good.
What if that awareness, which is ever present, I feel that awareness is there everywhere within all of us,
Great.
could that be it?
Well, you need to look. But you just said, didn't you just say you saw, what did you say, you saw the awareness? Or, no, what did you say before?
Experience that
You experienced the awareness. So you experienced the awareness.
or the awareness experiences the mind and the body.
But you said you experienced awareness, which is correct, it's fine. So if you say you experienced awareness, doesn't that mean awareness is not you? If you say you experienced awareness? So maybe that's interesting, so we need to check that. But maybe all these questions are still to come. So if it's something about this, you can ask. But otherwise, I think the answers will come.
Like in a meditation where we have to focus in our mind, in the thoughts and everything.
Sure.
In that way, we are observing our mind.
Correct? You are observing your mind.
Who is
Good.
observing the mind?
Sorry?
Who is observing
Well, that's what we were looking for, wasn't it? Where is the self?
Like there is a body and mind, someone is observing the mind.
Exactly. So that's what the question was. Who is doing, where is the self that is observing the mind?
So there is a self or there isn't a self?
Well, again, self, there's a person. You exist. The fact that you're observing the mind means you exist. If you don't exist, you couldn't do that. So the question is, how do we exist? It seems like there's a me separate observing the mind. Look for that me. That's what this meditation was about. Look for the me who's observing the mind. Look for the me who's relaxing the body. Where is that me that seems to be here somewhere? That's what we're doing.
But it seems, but it doesn't. No?
Very good. Excellent. Because if we don't investigate, it really seems like it's here, doesn't it? But when we look, we don't seem to be able to find it. Maybe that's telling us something. Maybe that we're not actually existing the way we think we are. But this is all to come.
I'm trying to realize if, according to Buddhism, thoughts and mind and emotions happening in the mind, or there is some host that can observe on the thoughts and emotions.
What's your experience? Is thoughts occurring in your mind, or is your mind there and the thoughts are over here?
It's like more the emotions and the thoughts.
Okay, well, emotions and thoughts. So, what's your experience? Is your mind, you're looking at your mind here and your thoughts and emotions occurring over here? Is that your experience?
Kind of, like the mind is somewhere above and the thoughts like...
So when you look at your mind, you don't see any thoughts because your mind is there and your thoughts are there.
Sure.
Really?
Yes.
And so you can look at your thoughts without looking at your mind.
This is more difficult.
Maybe that's also telling us something. Okay, so let's go to the third point.
I was thinking, well, this is very confusing, but if I am looking at my body and looking at my mind, for me, what it happened in the meditation was like, it seems to the same faculties of my mind were doing the activity of this other self.
Oh, good, interesting.
So maybe
So it seems, in your experience, it didn't seem like actually there was a separate me.
no, it wasn't, I'm not sure, but like a part of my mind, because I was like using the same faculties, was doing the work of observing the rest of that.
Very good, good, very good. Keep looking. Okay, let's go to the third one. There's a third level in which we overinflate the sense of me. And that is we are grasping on to what's called an inherently existent me. A me that exists from its own side. So to distinguish the three, the first one would be a sense of self somewhere over there. We don't have that instinctively. This one, the second one, is a sense of self that the me is here, that's something more than the body and the mind, something extra. This is a sense of self that the me is the body and the mind. So this means there's a sense that this is an extra thing, a third entity. This is a sense of grasping that the me is the body and the mind. And what we're going to see is that is a false sense of self, of me. And that's the one we're going to look at now. So this is the one that, this false sense of self is the one that is identified in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions as the root cause of suffering. And that's what we're going to spend now the rest of today looking at, this one. So let's do that. Now, first, before we go into our discussion, just a piece of advice, that this idea, and of course the insight there here is this insight into emptiness, is not so easy to understand. So if you're having an expectation that by the end of today you'll have a fairly good understanding of emptiness, I think you're just setting yourself up for a lot of frustration. A lot of frustration. Because what may happen is today I may start explaining and you'll go, oh yeah, I understand that. And then I'll keep talking and then you go, oh, I don't understand anything. And then I'll keep talking and you go, oh, now I really understand what he's saying. And then I'll keep talking and then you go, oh no, I'm completely confused. So if that's your experience, very good. Because it means we're starting to think about it. So this is a topic that we'll need to listen to many times and think about many times and meditate on many times before we really gain a clear understanding of emptiness. And of course what we're going to see is that that we won't be able to figure it out. You know, many of us in the modern world are very intellectual and we want to figure out everything. But as we're going to see, it's actually our intellectual mind that creates the problem because we're stuck in duality. And to have an expectation that we can figure it out with our dualistic mind, you'll never figure it out. Because that's where the problem is. So the only way we're going to figure this out is if we experience it in meditation. And there we go beyond the dualistic intellectual mind to direct experience. So that's another expectation we need to let go of, is if we think, I can figure this out intellectually. I mean, intellectually we can get an idea of this, but it's just an idea. To actually have conviction that this is the way it is, that only comes from meditation. From intellectual, we can go, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Yeah, okay. But it's still just then a theory, an idea. We have to internalize. We have to come to experience it. So let's begin. And to begin, remember here now we're building on the foundation in the Mahayana, which is the tradition that really came from these perfection of wisdom teachings of the Buddha. And in these teachings, the Buddha said, it's not just how we see ourselves that's a problem, but how we see the world as well. That there seems to be an independent, objective world out there, but actually it doesn't exist in that way. And from those teachings, from those perfection of wisdom teachings, there was a philosophical system evolving in ancient India from the 2nd century, particularly from this great Indian master, Nagarjuna, who wrote this classic text, Mula Madhyamika Karika, or Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, where he was explaining in his text this teaching on emptiness that the Buddha gave in the perfection of wisdom teachings. And that's the foundation of this Madhyamika philosophical system. And that's the one we're going to use as the basis for our explanations today. And before we introduce that, I'd like to read from, again, a book from Alan Wallace. Again, this book was called Tibetan Buddhism from the Ground Up. He says the following. Many of us believe that we directly perceive objective physical phenomena with our 5 physical senses. That the mental images we perceive via our senses are accurate representations of the objects we perceive. However, neurologist Antonio Damasio refutes this assumption, which is commonly called naive realism. So now he's quoting the neurologist who says the following. When you and I look at an object outside ourselves, we form comparable images in our respective brains. We know this well because you and I can describe the object in very similar ways, down to fine details. But that does not mean that the image we see is the copy of whatever the object outside is like. Whatever it is like in absolute terms, we do not know. Back to Alan Wallace, he says, in light of this neuroscientific view, with our 5 senses, we directly perceive images generated in the brain. But these are not truly representations of anything existing independently of the brain. These sensory impressions of colours, sounds, smells, and so on are no more tangible than thoughts or dreams. While we seem to experience colours and so on as they exist in the objective world, independent of our senses, this is an illusion, very much like a dream. Having determined that the reality we perceive depends on our sense faculties, what then really does exist outside our senses? When we close this book and leave the room, shutting the door behind us, what remains? It is an ancient question that has been asked since the time of the Greeks. What exists behind appearances? What really exists out there? This brings up a familiar problem. What happens when a tree falls and nobody is in the forest to watch it or hear it? Most people agree something happened. The tree trunk is on the ground, there is a big dent, things start to rot, and ants and termites live in the fallen trunk. But what happened? Western scientists have traditionally responded to this question by trying to find primary or intrinsic qualities of the falling tree that can be measured. Mass is one of those, the idea being that the tree has a quantifiable amount of stuff to it. Speed is another quality that does not seem to depend on anyone's perception. Briefly considering the history of Western scientific thinking on this point may be a useful digression that may help us better understand the nature of emptiness. Also, by examining our cultural assumptions about the nature of reality, we can better understand and penetrate those assumptions, and by so doing come to appreciate the Buddhist view. Since Galileo took his telescope and turned it on Jupiter, scientific thought has increasingly depended on the power of mechanical instruments. We get the sense, and it is widely promoted by science, that by using mechanical instruments and mathematics, we stop being subjective and instead become objective. Everyone knows the senses can be misleading, it is said, so let us dispense with the senses. They are only giving us appearances anyway, and we're trying to penetrate through those. The idea of objective measurement came to be strongly emphasised during the time of Galileo, and by the end of the 19th century, scientists felt the objective science of physics was virtually complete. The physics of the time was assumed, with very few exceptions, to be an absolute representation of what was really out there. At the beginning of the 20th century, this view began to break down. Scientists started to understand more clearly that their instruments of measurement were themselves contributing to the data they were detecting. But the real revolution came with the development of quantum physics, which investigates the very smallest components of physical reality. It is here that the participatory nature of measurement and experimentation becomes most obvious. In quantum mechanics, attributes of mass, speed, shape, and location vanish as purely objective entities. All of them can only be seen in relationship to the methods of measurement. As the renowned physicist Werner Heisenberg said, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. As scientists looked still deeper, they also started questioning the objectivity of the analytical tools they use. Mathematics, for instance, is one more human creation. Euclidean geometry is only one of a theoretically infinite number of geometries that can be used. And the same goes for algebra and for various logic systems. The subjective element seems to be inescapable on all fronts. In no facet of science, whether we are dealing with astronomy, physics or medicine, do we get even one bit of information about any reality existing independently of our modes of questioning. All our sensory experience consists of experiences that are contingent upon our sense faculties. Even by reducing everything to the subatomic level of electrons, quarks and so forth, we are still left with nothing but appearances. What is inescapable is that all that we know of the world, theoretically and empirically, consists of appearances to the mind. We have access to nothing else. Understanding this, the concept of reification becomes universally applicable. In the same way that we look out on the world and view perceived objects as if they existed inherently in objective space, so too do we view things like electrons and sound waves as if they existed independently of our conceptions of them. Perceived objects exist in relation to the conceptual schemata within which they are understood. We reify an object by removing it from its context, by ignoring the subjective influences of perception and conception. And just two more quotes here. First one from a theoretical physicist, John Wheeler, who was like one of the pillars of theoretical physics of the 20th century. He says, "Useful as it is under everyday circumstances to say that the world exists out there, independent of us, that view can no longer be upheld. There is a strange sense in which this is a participatory universe." And then one of the leading quantum physicists in the world today, Anton Zeilinger, he says, "One may be tempted to assume that whenever we ask questions of nature, of the world there outside, there is reality existing independently of what can be said about it. We will now claim that such a position is void of any meaning. It is obvious that any property or feature of reality out there can only be based on information we receive. There cannot be any statement whatsoever about the world or about reality that is not based on such information. It therefore follows that the concept of a reality without at least the ability in principle to make statements about it, to obtain information about its features, is devoid of any possibility of confirmation or proof. This implies that the distinction between information, that is knowledge, and reality is devoid of any meaning. Space is only defined by the bodies in space. The bodies define the space. The notion of space in itself, without stars and so on, is an empty concept. It does not make sense for a physicist. Space is a way of saying where something is. Time is a way to say when something happens. That can only be said in relation to something else. In itself, it has no meaning. I would say time belongs to those things of which we have learned that we can only make relational statements. So I would say there is no absolute time. It is only in relation to something else. And Anton Zeilinger, who's based in, I think, University of Vienna, has had quite a number of discussions together with the Dalai Lama. And of course, quantum physics can be interpreted in many ways, but certainly his interpretation of quantum physics is very close to this Madhyamika view we're looking at today. In fact, when they've been discussing together, Anton Zeilinger and Dalai Lama, the Dalai Lama is amazed at how Anton Zeilinger, or quantum physics, can come to the Madhyamika view by looking at doing experiments. And Anton Zeilinger is amazed at how Buddhists can come to that same view but through meditation. And actually there's an interesting article I read that tries to explain quantum physics in terms of this Madhyamika view that we're looking at today. And it's called The Direct Experiential Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. If anyone's interested, you can just Google that. Direct Experiential Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. The author's Kenneth Chan. But there was a question here before I begin.
Oh, yes. The 3 levels of explanation for self, I interpreted them as the first one is physical independence. The second one is...
Well, the first one
Yeah.
is the independent means independent of causes and conditions.
I find another
Sure.
way to as a physical independence.
Well, this would also be mental independence because it would mean we would have a sense of me over there somewhere. So it would be independent of the mind as well, completely separate. So it's only intellectual, but yeah, the second one?
The functional independence.
Functional. This means it means that independence in terms of it's an extra. It's here, but it's extra. It's extra. It's not. Yeah. And this one.
Perceptual independence.
No, I mean this one is that it is the body and the mind, so it wouldn't be independent of perception. This would be grasping on the self as the body and the mind. Yeah. Okay, so what we're talking about here in this Madhyamika view is that there seems to be an independent me here and an independent objective world out there. So then when we have this word independent existence, there are a number of terms we find in the text that are used to describe this. The first term, and the one that's commonly used, is inherent existence. And inherent existence has sort of the idea that things are self-existent, that the world is made up of many separate, discrete things, everything having its own unique identity. So that's inherent existence.
Can you repeat, please?
Sure. So the term inherent existence has the understanding of that things are self-existent, meaning that the world is made up of many separate, discrete things, and everything having its own unique identity. Another term that's commonly used is existing from its own side. And this has the understanding that things exist from their own side, meaning they do not need an observer for them to exist. That the world is already, there are already things existing there, and we just come along and confirm their existence. So that's what existing from its own side means. Existing without the need of an observer. And the third term that's often used is true existence. And true existence has the idea that generally things are true if they don't deceive us. Now, things appear to exist independent of us. If that's actually how they exist, they would be true. They wouldn't be deceiving us. So true existence means existing in the same way in which it appears. There are other terms used, but these are probably the three main terms that are used. And of course, all three terms are describing the same thing from a slightly different perspective. So these three terms are all equivalent in meaning. But of course, the assertion here is that things do not exist like this, that things do not exist independently. Things do not inherently exist. They do not exist from their own side, and they do not truly exist. And so the statement we often see then is, that things are empty of inherent existence because they are dependent arisings. So what we're saying here is that things are not independently existent, so that's the same here. Empty of inherent existence means not inherently existent, or in other words, not independently existent. Why? Because they are dependently existent. And the term used for that is dependent arising. Arising here means coming into existence, that things come into existence dependently. So again, the simple statement is saying things are not independently existent because they are dependently existent. So this phrase here, empty of inherent existence, this is emptiness. The Sanskrit term there is shunyata. So emptiness does not mean nothing really exists. Emptiness means simply things are empty of independent existence. In other words, things are not independently existent.
So they depend on something.
Right, so they depend on something. So now that's what we're going to look at. How are things dependently existent? In what way are things dependent arisings? Because if we can understand that, we can better understand what emptiness really means. So let's look at that. The first way in which things come into existence dependently is that things depend on causes and conditions. For example, this laptop here exists depending on causes and conditions. One of the first conditions necessary was someone needed to think about designing this laptop. And then, of course, all the raw materials needed to be gathered, they needed to be refined, the various components needed to be manufactured, and those components needed to be assembled. And of course all the people and factories and so forth also necessary. So all of these causes and conditions were necessary for us to have the laptop here today. So I think that's not so difficult to understand. And things exist, of course, also depending on their parts. So again, this laptop here exists depending on its parts. Because without the metal frame, without the screen, without the electronic components, the keyboard, the battery, without all of these parts, there would be no laptop here. So again, that's not so difficult to understand. Yet, what we're saying here is that because things are dependent, they're not independent. Yet, maybe for some of, or most of us in this room, we're quite happy to accept that this laptop exists depending on causes and conditions and its parts, yet at the same time we're happy to accept that when we walk in that door there's already a laptop existing here on the table. True?
Can you repeat?
We're happy to accept that this laptop exists depending on causes and conditions and parts, and at the same time we're happy to accept that when we walk in the door there's already a laptop existing on the table. You don't accept that?
No, because you run it.
No, if it's there.
Okay.
Yeah. So they're sitting there, and we walk in the door, we're happy to accept there's a laptop there existing already before I came in the door. Yeah? But that's illogical, because you can't have an independent laptop and a dependent laptop. They're logically contradictory. The laptop can't be dependent and independent at the same time. So why is it that we can hold those two contradictory ideas in the same mind? And the reason is because we don't understand these. We only understand them at a very superficial level. We don't understand them at the deepest level. To understand them at the deepest level, we have to go to the third way in which things are dependent. But first, we need to morning tea break. So let's come back at 10:45 and look at the